Welcome back, dear friends. In the previous training we talked about the stakeholders and the stakeholder analysis that we need to conduct in order to identify whom should we work with and how. The output of that stakeholder analysis was Stakeholder Register, which is a document that lists all possible stakeholders, their needs, interests, attitude and positions in relation to our target forest ecosystem. Now, equipped with the Stakeholder Register, we can proceed further to interacting with our stakeholders and engaging them into our forest management planning. However, if we haven't engaged our stakeholders in the planning process before, then it is likely that they don't know about us and what we propose for sustainable forest management. So we may need to communicate with them to inform them about our proposal and generally what changes this brings to each of these stakeholders. We may also need to educate them on the concept of ecosystem services and the value of the forest for their economic and social well-being. Now, educated with this information, having this knowledge about the ecosystem services in the forest and the benefits these services bring to each of them, the stakeholders are more willing and acceptable to receive us and to listen to our proposal. But here we have a challenge. We generate a lot of scientific complex information, especially in the economic evaluation research. And now, how can we communicate all this complex and sometimes confusing information to our stakeholders such as farmers, logging companies, ministries and so on? How can we translate the scientific language into layman's language so that our message is well received? And also, what channels should be used to convey our message in transparent, understandable and action-prompting manner? Certainly, there is no one-size-fits-all solution to these challenges. Every project and proposal and team may use different channels and approaches to communicate with their stakeholders. However, we can agree on some general principles of communication and education. So here are, let's say, the 5 big principles of communicating with our stakeholders and for educating them. The first principle of effective stakeholder communication states that we should focus our messages on specific stakeholders and adapt them to their needs and specifics. In this case, we should consider the attitudes, behavior, interests and levels of power and influence of each stakeholder to tailor our message directed to them. As you may understand, this is where our stakeholder register is very valuable, as it gives us all the information, all the specifics for each of the stakeholders, so that we can prepare messages to each one of them. For example, if we present our proposal for sustainable forest management and generally educate people about ecosystem services in the forest, and we do it with local farmers and residents of a local village, we may stress the importance of the forest as a source of pollination service, as the source of non-timber products that people could gather here, and the, let's say, the possibilities for development of ecotourism and additional profit for helping out ecotourists wander around the forest. However, if we go to state officials and government officials, then we may shift our message and direct their attention to long-term economic and social development of the region around the forest that is possible due to healthy ecosystem services in that forest. The second principle is very clear. We need to make everything clear and attractive to our audience. In our economic evaluation research, we may have willingness to pay data, complex graphs with confidence intervals, and so on and so forth. However, this will not gain us understanding and willingness to cooperate from our audience. What we need to do is to translate all this scientific information into commonly used, let's say, language, and to convert our scientific knowledge into common layman's language, into attractive infographics and clearly understandable comparisons. For instance, when making a point about the value of standing trees in a forest, we may consider giving our stakeholders a waterflow of scientific data from the field of biology, ecology, environmental science, and so on. However, we may change the perspective and compare those trees with thousands of air conditioners to make a point about the microclimate regulation ecosystem service, or the fields of water plants that these trees actually replace by doing the water purification service, or for example kilograms of medicines as an illustration of the health improvement service and disease prevention service that these forests allows us to have. And generally this comparison is very good in that people easily understand the benefits they get from a well-preserved forest and are more likely to support our proposal for sustainable forest management. The third principle of effective stakeholder communication is about the communication channels. We should use different channels to approach different stakeholders. However, we should also think which channels are suitable for which stakeholders and how each of them is used by those stakeholders. For example, some people are easily reachable through email and social networks and other online channels. But for other people, other stakeholders, direct meetings and live conversation should be the thing to do in order to engage them and in order to talk with them directly about the values of our forest. I have a very good example of this work with communication channels. In the Code Request research, we had to collect information from different users of the Kodur forest. And for the city residents, for example, we used mainly online communication channels in order to track them to our online survey so that they could complete it and give us the information we required. So we used emails, newsletters, and social network engagements to reach those stakeholders. However, we knew that if we want to gain information from the village residents living around the Kodur forest, we will fail if we use online channels, because those people don't have access to internet and even to a computer. So we sent out our colleagues and researchers who visited random houses, random families in the Lozova village and interviewed the respondents, the stakeholders directly there. This allowed us to gain information from both the city users going to the forest for recreation and the village users who benefit from the forest ecosystem services such as pollination, such as non-timber forest products for food and timber for fuel and heating. Now, going to the fourth principle of effective stakeholder communication. What do you think it is about? What would you suggest us to do in order to communicate with our stakeholders effectively? So yes, the fourth principle states that the message should go both ways, from us to our target audience and from the audience to us in form of feedback, comments, information, recommendation, and so on. Because it is likely that our stakeholders already know much on how they use the forest, what is going on there, and what they think should be done with the forest in question. Otherwise, it would be just a monologue from our side, which is not what we want. What we want is our stakeholders' opinion on the state of things in our targeted forest and also feedback on our proposal so that we know whether we need to change it and whether we need to change our communication strategy in general. This is what we did in the Kodru Quest research and education project, where we not only asked farmers and local residents about the forest in question, but also inquired about their attitude towards the current state, what they know about the plans for the forest management, and what they themselves suggest should be done in the forest. This allows our stakeholders to feel themselves as consultants and as contributors to the entire forest management proposal, discussions, and implementation. Finally, the fifth principle of effective stakeholder communication recommends us to include a call to action in all our messages. Indeed, we want our stakeholders not only to receive the information about ecosystem services and the value of the forest, we also want them to act upon this information and to consider our proposal for sustainable forest management in their decision making, or suggest an alternative proposal, alternative scenario. Therefore, call to action is like a bridge between our communication and the following engagement. An illustrative example that we can bring here is the call to action that we included in the Kodru Quest project. So we simply asked our stakeholders who completed the questionnaire to subscribe to our newsletter, to connect with us in our educational activities, and to supply us additional information about the forest, the uses of the forest, and what they think should be done there. We also approached several interested and influential stakeholders and asked them to help us either with volunteering for our project or as contact points in their community so that they could spread the news about the project, what we do with it, and what we propose in terms of improvement of the quality of ecosystem services in the Kodru forest. Overall, here we touched among just several principles of effective stakeholder communication. Certainly, you can find many more principles, methods, tools in the literature. So we encourage you to go to the website of the course, go to the reference list, and see any other resources you can find on communicating and engaging stakeholders. However, talking about engagement, our communication with stakeholders does not immediately translate into their engagement. So how can we capitalize on the communication activities and educational activities that we have already done in order to propose real action for our stakeholders to implement and for their decision making to favor our sustainable forest management? This is what we will talk in the second part of this final training of the course. See you there!